Welcome to Module 5 of Practical Preaching. Honestly, this is probably the one that I'm most excited about and most looking forward for you, because this module we're talking about how to preach without using notes. Now, you can use this advice to use fewer notes, but you can actually preach without using any notes. And for me, this is a personal thing for me because I always kind of thought that preaching without notes could only happen if you were super experienced, and it only happened when you got really good and you could just think of things off the top of your head. And I was like, man, it's going to take me forever to get there. And especially if I'm in a more theologically deep passage, or there's got to be, talking about a topic that needs more explanation or stories, like how am I going to actually be able to preach without notes? And here's what I would say as we begin this module, that we're not saying preaching without notes or with minimal notes is the best way or it is the only way. Obviously, different people have different styles, and God has used different people and different styles throughout history to communicate His truth. But I think generally the reality of the situation is this, that the less you have to look down at your notes and the more you can look out and connect with your people, the more effective it's going to be, particularly in the day and age in which we live today, where people crave authenticity, they crave just people being real, and you can be real and authentic reading your notes, but it doesn't come across that way as if you're having a conversation with someone. So I think preaching without notes or preaching with minimal notes is even more important in the day and age in which we live today. And I want you to let you know, as you're listening to this, maybe you're a complete manuscript person, or maybe you don't use a manuscript, but you use a ton of notes, and you're thinking, there's no way I will be able to ever get to a place where I'm not using any notes. I want to tell you, you can, because I was able to do it. So let me give you a little bit of backstory on my preaching journey. About 6-ish months ago, I began to set out to preach with no notes. Now, what I was doing up until that point at New City Church, and anytime I communicated somewhere, when I was preaching, I used about 5 pages of notes. So I used Google Docs, I have an iPad, and so I would do it horizontal in 2 columns each, and I would literally have about 75 to 80% of what I was going to say with my notes in front of me. Pretty much everything I was going to say except my stories were in my notes. Now, I didn't necessarily stare and read them the whole time, but they were all there. And I began to get frustrated because there were times where I didn't even have to look at my notes, but because they were there, I kept finding myself looking at them and not trusting myself at all just to be able to preach and not look down as much. And so I went from using 5-ish pages of notes to no notes at all in 6 months. Now, I'm not going to say that's your story, and people can go different lengths of time in order to get to however many notes that you may use to using no notes. I'm not trying to say you should compare your journey to mine. So all that to say, I want you to know that you can actually do this. And if you would have told me at the beginning of my 6-month journey from using 5-ish pages of notes to no notes, if I would have been able to do it, I would not have believed you. And so what I want to do is I want to help give you 6 tips that I followed that were helpful for me that you can also implement to help you significantly minimize the amount of notes that you do, and hopefully even maybe help you be able to preach with no notes at all. And so here they are. Here's point number 1. And this may be self-explanatory, but we have to actually believe this. We actually have to do this, and that's this, that you have to force yourself to take every step. You have to force yourself to take every step. And what do I mean by step? I mean that every time you reduce your notes, it's never going to be easy. It's never going to feel comfortable. It's going to freak you out a little bit, but you have to force yourself to do it. So what happened with my kind of journey from 5-ish notes to no notes is I went from 5-ish notes to 3-ish pages of notes, and I had to force myself to take that step. And then once I got comfortable with that, I went from 3-ish pages to about a page of notes. And then eventually I went from a page of notes to no notes at all. And every time I reduced the amount of notes that I brought up with me on stage, it was nerve-wracking, it was scary, and I was worried that I was going to mess up, or it was going to be super short, or it was going to be awkward, or I was going to forget stuff. Because we just got to know, every time we say, okay, I'm going to take less notes with me, you have to force yourself to do it. The only way to do it is to make yourself do it, and then you'll find that it's not as hard, not as difficult as you think. Now, if you go from, like my example, from 5 pages of notes to 0, I wouldn't recommend that. So you want to take steps. You don't want to do it all at once, but you just have to know that you're going to have to force yourself to take every step, but you can actually do it. So that's point number 1, force yourself to take every step. Point number 2 is that you should use the same outline every week. We use the outline that we talked about in this course. I use that outline for pretty much all of my preaching nowadays. And when you use the same outline every week, it begins to help you understand your message and your sermon better because you know the flow of it. Because here's the thing, if you don't use an outline, or if you don't structure your messages in a similar way every week, it becomes really hard to actually know where you're going without looking at your notes. And so if you use a similar outline every single week, you'll be able to get comfortable with that outline, and you'll be able to anticipate the flow and the structure of your message. Even if you get confused, even if you lose your spot, if you're familiar with the flow of your message, with the outline that you use, it makes it possible for you to use less notes, and then even possible to use no notes at all. So force yourself to take every step and use the same outline every week so that you're comfortable and you're familiar with the flow of your message. Here's point number 3, that you can use more slides on your screen. So this is one of the big ways that I was able to go from 5-ish pages of notes to now no notes at all, is that I actually use a lot more slides on my screen. So whether you have projectors or TVs or however you use to project your notes and your messages and your lyrics, you can actually use more slides. Now, as a side tip, you never want to put more than 1 point on your screens per slide, because what happens is anytime something pops up on a screen, people read everything on the screen before they focus back on the person who's speaking. So if you put multiple notes on the screen at once, people are going to be reading all of that and not listening to you. So you can have multiple slides, just do one slide, one screen or one note per slide, and you can use that as your outline, so you don't actually have to memorize your whole message. You just have to have these teaching points. And here's the thing, you could have those same notes in front of you, but instead of looking down, you're looking out. And now, of course, here's the deal with this. This does depend a little bit on the space in which you are sitting in or which you are preaching in. If you don't have slides, if you don't have screens, rather, this won't be as helpful. But if you have a screen next to you that you can look to, or if you have a confidence monitor in your space in front of you or in the back of your auditorium, looking at that or glancing at that as opposed to glancing down at your notes makes a really big difference. And so you can add more slides to your screens and use those as reminders for what you're supposed to talk about or what you want to say. Instead of trying to remember every little thing you have to say and memorizing your message, you can use your screens as your notes, and it doesn't look like you're actually using notes at all. Again, it allows you to keep looking up at your people instead of looking down. And just a side note as well with this is that there may be things like stories or illustrations that you want to use, but you don't want to put them on the screens because that would kind of defeat the purpose and that would look really weird. So what you can also do too, again, this kind of works better if you have confidence monitors, but if you have a space that this allows, is you can give yourself notes on your screens about, hey, say a story here without actually putting it on the screen that everybody sees. And regardless if you do that or not, here's what you just need to know. It's okay to use a lot of slides as long as you only use one slide per screen, and you can use those slides to help you walk you through your message as opposed to looking at notes. Now, of course, on those slides, that does mean that you're not going to have all your notes up there. You have to know what you're actually going to say, but it's a great way to not have to look down at all instead of just looking out and looking at the same screen or the same slide that everyone else is looking at, and it doesn't force you to look down at your notes. So point number 3, use more slides. It'll help you use less notes. Here's point number 4. This one may seem obvious, but it's vitally important, and that's this, that you have to commit to putting in the work to use less notes. You have to commit to putting in the work if you want to use no notes at all. Again, I used to think that the better you got at preaching, you just didn't need to use as many notes because you just knew what you were going to say and you can kind of memorize things better. And here's the deal. Your skill in preaching does get better the more you preach. But what I found is that for me to actually not use any notes at all, I have to do a lot more work to make it possible. Now, I would say it's vitally important. If you're a pastor, one of the biggest things that you do is preach, and so it's worth putting in the work. But you have to know there's no like, I'm just going to get good at this one day, and that's when I won't use any notes. Now, you got to force yourself to take the steps. Then you have to force yourself to put in the notes. Again, even when you're using screens, you have points on your screens, but you need to know what you're going to say about that point. You no longer can look down to remind yourself. You have to remember it and work on understanding your message. So I'm just going to be honest. It does take more work. As you do it more, you do get used to it more. But if you want to preach with minimal notes, or as I would try to encourage, with no notes at all, you have to be able to be willing to put in the work. It won't just happen just because you've been preaching a long, long time. So you got to remember, put in the work. And point number 5, here's a big one when it comes to using minimal notes or no notes at all. And that is this, that you have to be okay with forgetting things. You have to be okay with saying, oh, I was going to make this point, or I really wanted to say this and I forgot. Here's the good thing, right? Nobody knows what you are actually going to say. And so if you forget something, Nobody knows, right? Nobody actually knows you're going to forget something. And you know this to be true, right? You beat yourself up over this, but when you hear other people preach or communicate and they tell you, yeah, I forgot to say this or that, you don't think anything of it because you also didn't know that they forgot. So it is okay to forget things. We just have to be okay with forgetting things. And here's the reality of the situation as well, that if you forget something, it probably wasn't that big a deal to begin with. Now, I want to be honest. It doesn't mean that it's okay to forget it or that you shouldn't kind of be upset in some ways about it, or you couldn't be bummed, let's say, about it. And sometimes you will forget a major point that you're like, man, why did I forget that? It really would have tied things together. It really would have made more sense. Again, I wanted to let you know, nobody else knows that you forgot it. And I would say this too, that I think it is worth the trade-off of forgetting some things, even if we think they're very important, for us to be able to connect better with the people that we are speaking to. You know, it's funny, in our context at New City Church, the first few weeks that I started not using any notes at all, people actually, unsolicited, without me asking, without me doing anything, would come up, and I actually got a few emails and personal conversations with people of saying, I've noticed that you're not using any notes. I really appreciate that. I really connect with you better with you not looking down. And so I would just say this, that it is okay to forget things in order to connect with your people better. Again, the day and age in which we live today, people crave that connection. They want to see the genuineness. They want to see that you believe what you're going to say. And listen to me, writing notes and reading them does not mean you don't believe it. It does not mean you're any less genuine, but it can come across that way. So we've got to be willing to put in the notes, and we've got to be okay to forget things. And I would say that trade-off of forgetting things is worth it to help you connect with people better. And this is at least the point number 6, the final point that we're giving on how you can preach with no notes, is that you just have to learn to trust yourself. You have to learn to trust yourself, which is, again, why you have to force yourself to take every step. But you've got to be okay with forgetting things. You've got to be okay with, hey, I see this point. I'm going to talk about this for a little bit. Now, the skill of preaching without notes does develop over time. As you get more comfortable without notes, you become more relaxed and more easy to kind of explain things without having to remind yourself with notes and looking down all of the time. But you just have to learn to trust yourself. And the only way to trust yourself is to make yourself actually do it. It's okay to forget things. It's okay to ramble every once in a while because maybe you're thinking, well, I need my notes because if not, I'm going to ramble. Well, that matters, right? You should try. We should try not to ramble. But I wouldn't even say that trade-off is worth it to connect with people better. But you've got to learn to trust yourself. You know what's funny? Every time I reduced the amount of notes that I had, I thought that my sermons were going to be like 15 or 20 minutes long. And actually, that hasn't been the case at all. In fact, now I find myself going longer if I'm not careful. Why? Because I'm trusting myself better. Now, when we say trust ourselves, we don't mean don't prepare. We don't mean don't prep your sermon. We don't mean just kind of wing it. Not at all. We mean put in the hard work of developing a great sermon, of working towards using no notes in your sermon, but then trust yourself with the end result, knowing it's going to be okay to forget things. And so those are some tips to preach without notes. I'll say them really quick. Number 1, force yourself to take every step. It's not going to be easy, but you can do it. Number 2, use the same outline every week. That'll help you remember the flow of your message. Number 3, use more slides on your screens so you can look up instead of looking down. Number 4, commit to putting in the work. It's not going to be easy. I spend more time on my sermons now than I did when I used notes before, but it is so worth it. And number 5, be okay with forgetting things. You will forget things. It will be okay. And number 6, learn to trust yourself.